Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Ivana Schork, and today I want to discuss with you a little bit of my PhD research. The subject of my research was to evaluate sleep as a measure of animal welfare. But as you can imagine, PhD's research evolve and take different shapes and form, and I end up focus more on the methods that we could use to assess sleep rather than just looking at sleep as a metric of animal welfare. And this is going to be the topic of my talk today for you. So I know I'm kind of like preaching to the choir here, but when I started discussions with my supervisor about what we wanted to do for the PhD in terms of topics and looking at new outlooks, I come from a history of looking at different methodology, new metrics, and his research group also works a lot with developing those methods. And we got into a conversation about health, about analyzing health parameters, and up for some reason got into sleep and how sleep was not really evaluated, and it seemed there was like lacking, there was a gap in research despite of the enormous body of research we have within humans health and welfare, understanding that sleep is a main component. And that brought us also to different branch of the conversation where we're also talking about the method they're traditionally used and what we can do to improve it. And the big background motivation around this project was that we have been talking to industry, so I have some experience of working with industry as well, and we know that not necessarily will have specialized workforce behind people who work with animals. And by trying to evaluate welfare scientifically, sometimes we end up having this kind of like file traps where maybe we're not getting the best of the results because we cannot really tell if people know about what they are observing. Definitely we can teach them techniques, but sometimes having that expertise gets in the way as well. And the other topic, and that it was like more related than to sleep and trying to understand sleep, was because we are moving, obviously, like as animal welfare history has progressing to terms of like definitions and what we look for when we're trying to assess animal welfare, was the whole point of we need to move from only looking at the negative, trying to measure the positive as well, and talking about animals having a quality of life very similar to what us as like a species experience. You like have all ups and downs in life, and we should not be thinking kind of like deterministic vision that animals can only have negative experience or only have positive experience, or that kind of like positive experience are removed or difficult to give animals, which bring us to the whole subjective experience. So we have been seeing like an increasing to people trying to understand more of this subjective side, but it is difficult to measure because we're talking about mental states, and measuring mental states not necessarily are easy to do without invasive techniques. And then we start to hit a lot of areas here, ethical, but also practical measures where I cannot really take a giraffe, which is one of the animals I end up studying for my PhD, to do an EEG in lab. But also, there's no portable way of doing this inside of zoo. But also will be, like a temporary stress, and we don't want to do that with animals. So we are kind of like, I'm not going to say trapped, like in a way that we cannot really do research, but we are limited. I think that was the word I was looking for. And also, when we do evaluate sleep, even though that we are evaluating species or a group of animals, we try to center this into the individual, which is not a problem whatsoever. Like, obviously, especially the subjective experiences will be individually. But then again, if we go back to the point of trying to facilitate animal welfare measures to make this, like metrics more employable, broadly used within different animal industries, we cannot be always individually centered. And this kind of poses the question, like, what can you use that could be like kind of like simple enough methods that could be easy to either develop or automatized, but also, that would not demand to always have somebody that has the expertise and the knowledge, but could work with a simple system maybe where they can identify patterns or shifts in animals that can be used then to evaluate their quality of life. So the whole reason of trying to look at sleep is because we don't have a single simple solution to measure welfare, and maybe we should be looking at single solutions to do that, again, to increase the applicability of the techniques we have been using to access welfare. And this kind of like all discussion, like with this background brought us on again looking at sleep, and as I said, like not discussing only on the premise that it has not been investigated, but because sleep has some characteristics as a behavior that can facilitate the way with how we measure it, how we see it. And a little bit of a spoiler alert, because I'm still going to be discussing this like within our introduction, but we are looking at an active changing mental state when we look at sleep. So when we go from wakefulness to sleep back to wakefulness, we are seeing a change in brain function. Now, though I cannot specifically measure this without being invasive, definitely if you have a metric where you know how much the animal should be sleeping, and then for some reason the animal is no longer showing the same pattern of sleep, you can 100% know that there is a problem with brain function. So this is really interesting how we could try to connect those dots without necessarily have to go through a more lab road where you'll be investigating. But as I said, like getting ahead of myself, let me give you a little bit of introduction of what is sleep. So sleep biologically is defined as a momentary and reversible state of immobility where your sensorial responses are reduced. And it's important that we have this definition because we have we have another biological behavior, which is a coma, that does happen, that does impair brain function, or that shows changes in brain function. But as I said, it's important to limit that, because when you have a coma, when you have that state of permanent unresponsiveness, this is what is happening with brain function. It's not momentarily, and not necessarily the individual is able to record what is happening with this environment while in this state, which is not the same as sleep. So sleep, although yes, the brain will have different levels of activity, you still going to be seeing, at some point this is going to be reversed. And if there is, for example, a threat that is imminent, such as a loud noise, we can just, like wake up like this. We don't need a kind of like phased out process to be able to reverse that state. And sleep is also defined by three conditions. You have a presence of a specific posture. So most of the animals will have a restful position that it's going to be most of the time, like laying down and being completely immobile. And you're going to see that there is a change in their homeostatic regulation. So you go again to immobility, then you have a reduction in some of the normal biological functions, and then that animal will be in that specific posture, however it looks like, for a certain period of time until the biological functions resume. And that is regardless of species. And I do have that phylogenetic tree just to show you. We do have basically every single animal kingdom has species that do demonstrate either sleep states or sleep-like states. So it's not something that is exclusive of some animals who have further brain development. Actually, you do have this to very simple, what would be considered like simple life forms, such as squirrels do present it. And I think there were about like a month ago, there's also a really interesting paper that come out talking that maybe what we actually evolved was not a conscious state, but the unconscious state. So sleep came after wakefulness, when actually we have thought for a long time that it was the other way around, which is quite interesting. And sleep has some, as I said, like some specific characteristics. So it is part of our circadian rhythm. So it's part of our biological clock. So it's regulated by both internal and external factors. And they will have a specific pattern that will be repeated every 24 hours for that particular individual. Also is an intrinsic part of our homeostasis process. So we'll see that hormones and external triggers will define its onset. Also, will define its latency, so how long it lasts for. But also, the sleep will be associated with other processes such as brain activity, um, appetite, exercise, energy, and so on and so forth. And for a very long time, which is quite interesting, sleep was believed to only serve a particular function, which was like to give the body rest. So we're doing some restoration of energy, balance, that basically we exerted our energy for the day and then we need to recover. But now, as I said, like with the broad literature, especially focused on humans, we do know that sleep does not have only one particular function, but most importantly, is that the function of sleep is associated with these different phases of sleep, which is quite important as well, which means that all animals need to go through all the different phases of or different stages of sleep to be able to fully complete its function. And we also know the sleep loss is negatively impacted by a lot of external factors and also can impact our thermoregulation, our energy balance, immune responses, and brain functions. And I will bring some further details just in the next slide. So as I said, sleep is associated with different brain functions specifically, but also some other bodily functions. So when you look at the different stages of sleep, they will be connected to a specific mechanism within the biological system of that particular individual. To facilitate things, I will keep sleep with two big phases. So we have non-REM sleep, which tends to be our like kind of like slow wave sleep, where the brain activity actually reduces because you're mostly focusing, sorry, on the bodily functions, so trying to restore metabolic processes mainly. And then we have the REM sleep, that is also known as the active sleep phase, where the brain is as active as if it was during a wakefulness, and is this in this stage in particular that we dream. So from, as I said, like the growing body of literature, we do know now that the slow wave sleep, so REM sleep, is associated mainly with restoration of bodily functions. It helps with the lower metabolism to get rid of free radicals in our blood that compromises a lot of our other biological functions, and also preventing help to prevent acceleration of the aging process. During child development, for example, this specific stage of sleep is associated with the release of growth hormone and regulation of that process. Also is this phase of sleep that helps enhances our immune responses. And in terms of brain activity, is more about the plasticity and the synaptic homeostasis. So basically, it's just repairing the architecture of the brain in terms of its function. And then for the active stage, so REM sleep, we have the whole consolidation of memories needing that phase to be fully completed. So that's why not only we have a lot of cognitive impairment when we have a really bad night of sleep, like we feel drained, have a lot of brain fog, but also, like especially with my students at the moment and their assessment period, pulling some all-nighters, really impair memory. It doesn't help you consolidate those processes. So you need proper sleep to be able to remember things effectively. Also, it helps with the process of what is kind of like the overload cortical networks. So basically, when we go through trauma responses or, like either intense stress responses, we tend to overload our brain. Obviously, we are triggering an alarm system in the body. So it's during this phase of REM sleep that we're going to kind of try to bring the brain back to the normal levels of functioning. Then it does help with, again, some process of body homeostasis, especially with thermoregulation. Also is the phrase where you have mass of brain growing during development. And also it helps with the genetic reprogramming of behavior. So everything that is connected to changes that we have in behavior happens during this phase. And that's why a lot of the diseases that are associated with the brain, such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson, depression, they heavily affect sleep, because then again, like you're having some big changes in behavior and brain responses for some, like patterns that were previously established, and the REM function specifically is here highly impaired in people who have those conditions. And what happens when we don't sleep? So I could actually do like an entire talk just talking about how bad it is when we don't sleep, but we have this nice review from Nature, and basically anything that impairs sleep will impair another system. So we have mental health effects, so it increases stress responses, anxiety. If it is long term, can be connected to depression or aggravation of depression. Also affects a lot of our cardiovascular responses. So people who are more susceptible to heart attacks, for example, tend to have poor sleeping patterns. Also, it may impair reproductive systems, our circadian rhythms, obviously, which will affect your metabolism. So you slow your metabolic processes when you're not sleeping well, which is paired with an increase of the necessity, to accumulate energy, so you feel hungrier when you don't sleep properly, and that is also combined some peak with like sugar peaks in the blood. So there is a connection between, for example, obesity and people who have impaired sleep conditions, and also gut-related diseases are also associated with poor sleep. And there's even an association with propensity of cancer development. So this research comes looking at shift workers, so people who actually work during the night when our brain is evolutionarily programmed to sleep. And you see those people have a propensity to develop more cancer because of the shift in their sleeping patterns. And when we talk specifically about welfare, so what is the specific connection between sleep and welfare? So, as I said, sleep is intrinsically connected with your brain function. So, as I said before, when we go from, like wakefulness to sleep, then to wakefulness again, your brain is changing from an active to a more inactive stage to a more active stage. And this could help us, for example, as I said, sleep fragmentation specifically could give us an indication of poor brain function that could be associated with the overall health and well-being of the individual. Also, another thing that is quite important is that sleep has a big emotional component. So not only, as I said, like poor sleep will unleash some chemical imbalance on the brain. So people tend to get really more like angry or moody when they sleep, like they are not sleep properly, but also because emotional experiences during the day tend to affect the way that is sleepless night, especially if they are connected, as I said, like with traumatic events or a lot of stress, acute stress responses. You see a direct effect in the brain function, and that also, as I said, like can be kind of mapped throughout the life of an individual. So if you think about it, we know that in captivity we have, or like any other system where humans are managed by humans, there is a lot of lack of control from the animal, and that also overloads, like the adrenal system. It will at some point start impacting their sleep, and then, as I said, it kind of starts to bring all together if we want to connect to more subjective experiences of trying to understand those sleeping patterns, especially if they are connected to more emotional responses or negative and positive experiences. And then, because we do know that sleep loss will affect the entirety of the system of the animal, and that, like in long term will compromise welfare. And as I said, most importantly, because there is a connection specifically between sleep and stress is the main issue that we have for negative outcomes when we look at health and well-being of animals under human care. So just to give you a closer association, what stressful sleep looked like. So what we have here is that we have a negative feedback loop of control between cortisol, our stress hormone, and also melatonin, our sleep hormone. So they're both controlled by the pineal gland. And basically, when you have excessive cortisol in your brains, in your bloodstream, that takes longer for the body to relax. So you were producing cortisol during the night, and then you release that early morning, and then basically you consume that level of cortisol throughout the day. And then when we get around 6 in the afternoon, that absence of cortisol or the highest concentration of cortisol in the bloodstream, associated with light levels. So the pineal gland is externally controlled by the presence or absence of light. Then that will release the onset of melatonin. And then around 9 p.m., we start to feel sleepy. But we do need to melatonin, again, to be basically consumed from our bloodstream, then for cortisol to be produced and released again. So as I said, like there is a close relationship between the two hormones. And what happens when we have enhanced stress responses is that you produce more cortisol, so it takes longer for you to sleep. And because you are sleeping less, then also it kind of like overloads the functioning of the pineal gland, and at some point you start to lose sensitivity, so you lack a little bit of regulation on that hormonal release mechanism, which start to affect sleeping patterns. And from research conducting both humans but also other animals, we do know that specifically stress responses will affect sleep quality and quantity, will effectively reduce REM sleep, compromise the individual's immune system responses, then also will increase the susceptibility to obesity and hypertension. So again, this is lack of sleep coming from stress responses. Then we have increased aggression, increased anxiety and depression, also can impair cognition and disrupt the circadian clock as a whole in both human and non-human animals. So here is a way that you can really see why it's important that we're trying to modulate a little bit of the stress responses, because they will be directly affecting sleep. So if we think about it, as whole, sleep appears to be a good metric. So why we are not using sleep more or more efficiently, to try to use it within animal welfare? And it all comes down to how do we measure sleep. So obviously we can observe the animals, and sleep is a state. So it's a behavior with long duration, which makes it a good candidate to be observed. But if you think about the amount of labor and hours of observation and everything that has to come behind it to be able to observe it, you start to have a issue, because not everyone will be able to or have that capacity, to be able to observe such a long behavior. But also, because this is one of the things that I'll be discussing later, is that anything that you do for a long time, you start to become prone to error because you start to have fatigue. So observation fatigue is a thing, beside animal behavior research. So this is one of the things that it makes it a little bit difficult. But also because most of the scientific community still believe that we only determine if an animal or a human has a proper night of sleep, good or bad sleep, if we focus on having those animals going into a lab, or humans going into a lab and having EEG attached to their heads so we can read their brain waves. And there's been some advances, obviously, in science in trying to facilitate this process. So, for example, you can find some portable EEGs that have been used in horses, in like small furries, and we even have some subcutaneous implants. So, have been tested again for horses, but also have been used even in sloths in the wild. But then, if we go and try to look from the ethical perspective, like how much we actually want to do this. So specifically for that study with the sloths, they cut the wild slug, they did a tiny surgery, implanted, like there's microchips, they go under the skin. So it's considered like the least invasive procedure that you can do in an animal, but still need to put it under anesthesia. Then you have to release this animal. We don't know really how this could affect the animal in day-to-day activities. And then after, I think they did like a week of observation, they have to recapture those animals to remove the device. So not necessarily this is the most effective, but also, again, from an animal welfare perspective, not what we wanted to be doing if we are really concerned about not causing any bias on the data set, but also like not inflicting any further compromise on an animal that may have already a compromised life. But mainly, as I said, this has been the main issue. So when we start discussing what we wanted to do in terms of study, like, so let's use sleep. Yes, there is a very good indication that sleep could be a good metric for animal welfare, but we need to find a way where we're not going to be doing EEGs. So what I wanted to do and end up doing for my PhD was to try to develop a method of observation, not a development method of observation, but to show that behavior observations could be a reliable metric, but also that maybe we could automatize the way that we are measuring the behavior, so we don't have that labor consuming method having to be used. That is also something that put people out of doing research with sleep. So our study focused in three main realms. We look at the sleep behavior, we looked at sleep physiology, and also we look at the sleeping environment of the dogs. And to be able to monitor sleep and to access sleep, then we end up using three different methodologies. We did the behavior normal observation. The physiology was taken with a biometric collar, and I'm going to talk about it in just a couple of slides. And then the environment itself, we are measuring, for example, noise levels and light levels. And we also end up using AI to try to automatize the behavior observations. And that is kind of like my surprise card that come out of nowhere in the middle of the PhD. And it was quite a nice, or one of the best contributions that my PhD had in the end, and that was not something that we planned. So as you know, PhD studies, especially for behavior, they are kind of complex. Behavior is something that you have to do a long-term observation. So I will show you how we do like the main concepts and approaches and methodologies, but obviously my thesis is available if anybody wants to look at the full thing. And also we do have already some publications that people are also welcome to read to understand a little bit more. So the research topic was to use sleep as a measure of animal welfare assessment. Then the main concept was to understand the sleep structure on those particular dogs that we were looking at. Also try to understand how sleep laws affect other behaviors. Very important to make a note here that obviously we did not in any shape or form compromise the sleep of the animals. So we were looking at natural fragmentation of sleep. So that's why I was taking those behavior, but also like environmental metrics, because, maybe it's a louder day in the kennel and maybe it's the noise that causes a little bit of stress, and then the animals are not really happy, like not in the best sense. And that maybe can cause some stress responses that will, eventually impair the sleep. So we look at natural fragmentation of sleep. And then we use the PET space color to evaluate sleep and other biological metrics, because what I wanted to do again was try to combine this is how sleep looks like in dogs in terms of the behavior, but also we can see here that maybe there is a change in their heart rate variation, which is associated with a change in maybe sleep phase. So trying to, like build those connections. And then lastly, we measure sleep using an artificial intelligence and computer vision to try to automatize the process of behavior observations, to try again to create a system that people could use, would not need a lot of training, but could be like a flag system to say something like, your dog sleep for 10 hours for the past 3 months, and now it's sleeping only for 5 hours. So maybe you need to now go and check to see what's happening with that particular individual. And to do this, we did 8 months of data collection. So this was continuously nonstop, 5 days, 24 hours assessment. I had 13 dogs. I had 14 initially, but then unfortunately one dog had to be removed from the study in the middle of it. Then we did behavior sampling, both nocturnal and diurnal. So during the day, because obviously the dogs were doing much more, we had a full ethogram, and then we were looking at 15 minutes, random 15 minutes every hour, and recording behavior at every 30 seconds interval. And then at night, we had continual observations. And for this, because my main thing was to assess sleep itself, so I needed duration of the behavior. I wanted to see if the duration, and then as I said, like the number of bounds, so how many times the animals wake up and went back to sleep and then wake up again. With continuous observation that takes that longer, we basically combined the ethogram in three main categories. So active was anything that the dogs were doing that were active, that this could be as simple as them being sitting down with their eyes, or laying down, but having their eyes open and paying attention to their surroundings, to actually being interacting with each other or eating, like the normal pattern of behavior. Then we had inactive, where the dog will be not responsive to the environment or sleeping, and that will be the sleeping where we could see the eyes were closed and the animals had no perceived body movement for 2 minutes, then that will be considered an onset of one of the sleep episodes. As I said, we also recorded the bounce, so how many times the dogs went from wakefulness, so that is one bounce, so we counted how many times that happened per night. And then the sleeping postures, if they're sleeping on their side, which side, on their bellies, on their backs. We also took cortisol measurements every single day, and that was using the fecal sample, so dog feces, every day in the morning. We started the observations on Monday morning and stopped on Saturday morning, so I would have some 5-day samples, so Tuesday through Saturday mornings we were collecting the sample, because that represents the stress profile of the animal of the day before. And also, as I said, we measured some of the environmental metrics such as light levels, temperature, and also noise levels, so decibels, within the kennel environment. Then, as I said, simultaneously, sorry, I'm just going to go back so I can just show you. As you can see here, this is the collar. It's very small to me because I'm using the presentation view, but hopefully you can see it. The dog's laying down. There is a collar on its neck here. So the dogs had the pet pace on in each week of observation. And basically the pet pace was recording all the body functions once every 15 minutes throughout that 5-day period. And then the collar has an acoustic device that basically measures the heart and has respiration rates based on sound, so sound of the respiration, but also sound of the heartbeat, because it stays on the kind of like bottom middle portion of the dog throat, so it's very close to the artery, and is able to pick up the sound. And then also the collar has its own accelerometer, and the accelerometer, obviously we could not set up for like any intervals, because every time the dog shifted its position, then the accelerometer will shift its orientation on its own axis and it will record. But the good thing of the pet face, it has 7 behavior categories predefined, so the algorithm can adjust to the type of movement, and then it would classify how long the dog spent on a particular position. And you had something as, again, like laying on either of the sides, back, belly, standing up, sitting down, and eating as part of those predefined categories. And also it calculates activity levels. So for example, has a threshold for rest, minimum, median, and then maximum activity. So high activity, low activity, and then a rest, but it does not have a specific sleep stage. So what I had to do to try to calculate when comparing our methods to sleep was to look at all the points where the activity point was 0, and see if that combined to our time frame of sleep was similar. And then I divided all those occurrences for the number of bounce per night, so we kind of got a percentage of time that the dogs were sleeping per night as recorded per the collar. And then lastly, and hopefully this will work, as I said, we partner with Tech for Animals Lab in the University of Haifa, Israel, Dr. Anna Zamansky. I met her in a conference in 2018, and she was looking at people who had a lot of footage of dogs. So I went to her and said, like, I almost have like 6 months of footage. Does that help? And from that initial conversation, we end up adapting a pre-existing system. So that was created to track dog movement. So that is called the Blazer system, so behavior analyzer system. And it was adapted then to learn how to record dog behavior. And hopefully this will work now. Okay. So from that video is just to give you an idea on how the system works. And I will do my best now to try to explain this, but please bear in mind, I am not a software engineer, so I don't understand a lot of the particularities of the system. If you are somebody who is more tech savvy and likes, like AI algorithms, this has been published in 2019. So the entire architecture of the system is published, and you can find it online. But basically what we have, so we have the client, which is our footage. And what the system application does is that you feed the raw video into the system, and then it will look at frame by frame as it grows throughout, like all the extension of the video, and will initially detect the dog. So this is what you do if you have one dog or multiple dogs. And also, and then once it sets the boundary box, so you can see it like around here is yellow and blue. It can identify what stage the dog is, if it is sleeping or not sleeping. And basically how it does this is that between those frames, once it has the boundary box, is that the image is converted in black and white. And then the system is kind of like a blurring of the image, and then it calculates the area where basically the body of the dogs exist. And then from frame by frame, it can calculate the shift in the shadows. So it's basically not looking for the dog, but for the absence of part of the dog to identify the body posture. And obviously the system didn't learn this by itself initially. And the system was fed with a training set of 80,000 frames. And the people from the lab automatically were telling, like the system, what was it, like if it was a sleeping dog, awake dog. And then because it's convolution neural networks or deep learning, it learned by itself. So with, like the repetition, the algorithm at some point will pick it up. And then basically you continue to feed the frames to the system within the training set, and then it is manually annotated by the researcher at the laboratory if the system is correct or incorrect. And then again, the algorithm can adjust itself, and at some point then it's able to predict if the dog is sleeping or awake. And our system has been refined, as I said, like to identify specific individuals. So we knew if it was, for example, we have Apollo and Alfalfa, so two of our dogs here, so we could identify which dog it was. And also, as I said, if it was sleeping or awake. And after the video is fed into it and it calculates, it would give us as an Excel, as a basically spreadsheet Excel output, the duration of the sleep, but also how many bounds. So the same thing that we are calculating. And I think we can see it in another quick video, just how it was calculating. I don't know if you can see it's a little bit small to me, but the system then is just basically count seconds in that particular posture, which is the same thing I was doing when we were observing the dogs. So what were our main results? Because I'm just a little bit conscious of time, so I'll try to get through this within the time people gave me. I just wanted to bring some of the behavior results. I know like the whole idea of the talk is to talk about the systems and like the automation process, but I think it's important to show that we did find very good indications that we could be using sleep as a metric of welfare. So we did see that both quantity and quality of sleep directly affected dogs' behavior. So the definition of quality on my paper was number of fragmentations per night. And we saw when the dogs had higher fragmentation and less sleep quantity in total, that would affect their behavior during the day. So the dogs will be more inactive. You also see more food consumption, which again links back to the same thing that have been seen in humans of being hungrier when you slept poorly. Also, we had diminishing play behaviors and alert behaviors, which obviously shows a little bit of lack of energy of these dogs when they are sleeping not as well as they should. And mostly, as I said, is a change in the sleep structure. And the main result, and probably the most concerning here, is that dogs are what we call polyphasic sleepers. So they sleep during the night and during the day. So you see bouts of sleeps along the longer sleep proportion tend to be at night. There is a lot of environmental factors can contribute to that. So, for example, pet dogs tend to follow a little bit of their owner sleeping schedules as well. But you see, they take a lot of naps during the day, and this is natural behavior not only for dogs but for a lot of canids. And what we saw with our dogs, yes, they slept more throughout the night, but comparing to what is known out of average sleep dogs, that is between 9 to 10 hours, our dogs were sleeping 6.5, which is 3 hours less, so a little bit concerning. And we do believe this has to do with the environment of the kennels, but also during the day, the dogs did not sleep. We had so little recordings of sleep during the day, but it had a lot of inactivity. So the motivation for sleep is there. They just basically not being able to sleep, probably again because of the environment they are in. So as I said, in the image here, you can see inactivity. The three categories of inactivity was the ones that the dogs spend most time in. Then we also seeing some very particular patterns of sleep changes associated with the environment. So noise was the main factors affecting sleep responses. So the dogs were more restless and also showed less consumption, did not sleep or not display maintenance when stressed by loud noises. And then again, this is a combination between their behavior, then stress responses, looking at the decibel levels, and then also at the sleeping patterns. And also we saw the light and temperature also contributed to diminished sleep in dogs. So higher temperatures, the dog affected their sleep duration, and also light levels. So these dogs in these kennels didn't have any artificial lighting. It's all natural lighting. So when we got to summer in Brazil, as you can imagine, like it's a very long day, then the sleep was basically reduced because of the long hours of light. What I want to show you here is that those circles are the peaks in decibel. They are followed by those bars, which are peak in cortisol. So loudest days were followed by peaks in cortisol levels on the following day. So you see an accumulation of stress responses. And then if you look at the pattern of sleep, it's more, so this is a sleep fragmentation on the bars on the top. And then you can see that you have increasing fragmentation throughout the week, especially between those loudest days when comparing to the weekend, especially like Friday night to Saturday, because then it's very quiet around, like the kennel areas. And you could see the sleep efficiency basically of the dogs increased on those days. Then our color. So the pet pace is quite interesting. First, it was very handy, if you were doing a study where you only using the color to understand behavior is a really good metric. Again, because it's picking up a lot of the same patterns we did, but we did have a lot of significant differences on daily activity behavior and also night activity and activity behavior. But that is actually a problem with our methods, not a problem with the color per se. What happened here is that obviously when the color was picking up a change every second, that is much more data than us looking at every 30-second interval, 15 minutes per hour, because obviously human power really diminished. But what I want to show you here is that we have the same patterns, although we didn't have the same amount of activity, total percentage of time spent active. These are all the different dogs on my research. And as you can see, the peak of their activities, who was more active, the colors kind of have the same trend, which was a good indication. What we didn't have as precise in terms of trends is the sleep pattern, but then again, because the color was quantifying rest, and rest had a little bit of a margin for the threshold. So if the animal, for example, was awake but resting, the color could not quantify that as sleeping because obviously they cannot see the dog's eyes, and we couldn't. But again, when I did those calculations, as I said, looking at periods of rest zeros, so a lot of zeros divided by the total number of rests in total within the period of the night, and then did kind of like a proportion of behavior, then the color had the same pattern of observation of us. So looking at basically the animal being inactive is quite precise, but obviously it will need some refinement to be able to actually say the dog's is sleeping or not, but still a good metric. I unfortunately could not use any of the biological indicator data, so heart rate variation and respiratory rate, because we had a lot of flaws in picking up that signal. Then again, this is an issue with our setting. The kennels did not have internet, so this collar is live streaming to a cloud. Basically, it has its own hub, so it's transmitting. If you its own in contact with this hub, is transmitting instantaneous information. But we had to remove the color after 2 or 3 days to be able to download the data, and that process. We did have some loss of data and we had some big variation. So we didn't consider the metrics for the physiological metrics as reliable to look at sleep patterns, but definitely just to explore, although I have not included here, to explore the physiological metrics of the dogs during the day. Like you can see the changes in respiration rate and heart rate, but for during the night it was not what we needed for this research. One thing that was quite good from using PetPace, we talked straight with the developer, so they were a collaborator in terms of, they did the initial consultancy with us on how the color worked and how we, could use it, trained us. But then they were never involved on the research, so there's no conflict of interest here. And when I ended my project, they wanted, as I said, to remain kind of a neutral partner because they wanted feedback. So we provided loads of feedbacks and features that they could improve, things that we think that need to be refined. So the results have been published. Like we mentioned, a few of those things that we think that needs improvement on the color. I know they're launching a new version of the color soon, and they are including a sleep index. So how that's going to work, I don't know, but I'm quite curious to see. But as I said, like I think as an instrument to aid in research was quite valid, especially as I said, like when you're looking at long behaviors, if you have, like internet connection is a really, really nice to use. Then our system, you will apologize because I cannot share a lot of the information here because the paper is under review. But just to give you like an overview, the system is 98% accurate, 89% accurate. We have no significant difference in percent of our sleep. In duration, we have because the system picks more than us. So this is one of the things that is interesting. And we do have some other tiny differences because of footage loss. So again, is a setup issue, not an issue with the system. But we are looking into get more people. So if you are somebody who is researching dogs and maybe are interested in trying to automatize the process, obviously the system has a learning curve, and at the moment we kind of hit a plateau because my images don't change anymore. So the system basically learned anything that could from that particular data set. So to be able to further refine it, we need new data sets to try to get it as accurate as possible, but something that is already almost like 90% accurate has a good indication of being good enough to use. And believe me when I said it was a lifesaver, because like the system, like developing the system obviously took 6 months, but to do the data analysis, it really took like a couple of hours, and we took a year of us sitting down when like I had 3 interns, part of 3 students were part of the project. So that took a long time to be able to process all the footage, all the dogs. So it was really time consuming, really tiring process. So it was really, really nice to see that we could develop something that can automatize that process. And as said, the paper is currently under review, so hopefully it will be out soon enough. Okay, so some considerations for future direction. It's still difficult, obviously, to separate some of the cause and effect of sleep. We do need more investigations. I still don't think we were in a stage where I could say like, oh, this is reliable information to say that this is what is causing the dogs to lose sleep. We have some good indications, but again, it could be some other issues, and we definitely need to continue to refine methods. But we did saw, like postures could be reliable in terms of looking at fragmentation. So there was a relationship, the dogs prefer to sleep. I think I forgot to include that on the results, I'm sorry. On the left side, so there is indication maybe that is the best position to have more sleep efficiency. But then again, this is one of the things that we have to further test. Observation is definitely great to understand sleep, but very time consuming. So trying to automatize this process obviously is beneficial. technology can be tricky. So as I said, like we had some data loss due to connectivity and other problems. So for example, with the images, when there is noise, so for example, the cameras were cheap. They were not the best quality. They're just normal CCTV cameras. So when there was some wind and the images will just basically shake, so the system was not as accurate as picking up, like the AI could not really pick up the different shapes because of the noise. But again, better systems or continue to refine the system will take some further months, but it's something that we could definitely do to try to improve its accuracy. It's very important, obviously, to mind the species we are working with. Dogs were good model species because dogs have been researched in terms of sleep, in terms of a lab setup. So I had patterns. Also, dogs have been being used in sleep research for humans. So we know a little bit more of them, especially because they're in the same environment as us, but it's not the same for other species. So especially if you're working with wild species. So as I mentioned, I had giraffes. I did collect a lot of data with giraffes, but this project became so massive with the dogs that I never had the time to analyze the giraffe data. So this is something that we are working at the moment. I do want to adapt the system to giraffes as well, but we already see many differences because their sleep patterns are different. So we do need to do some adjustments again in relation to trying to understand for those specific species uh, how sleep quality could be a factor. But then again, not necessarily needs to be expert knowledge, could be a system that is just quantifying how long the animals are sleeping for. And then if there is an initial red flag there, then further investigations could be carried to try to understand the context. And the question again here is like, do we need invasive techniques to measure sleep? Obviously, we do need to do more observations with more species, but if we're already getting, and the good thing about science is that it's always, like growing. So since I started studying sleep, there's been a few publications out. There was nothing when I started in my PhD, but now you already have something. I had Linda, I know she gave, she's one of my colleagues at Harper, and she gave you a talk about looking at sleep in horses. We're actually collaborating in a research at the moment, looking at further things with sleep. There's been some publication around elephants, some publications with a lot of farm animals. So we're starting to see some more patterns. And a lot of them is looking at automation and how to facilitate that process and looking at behavior and moving away from EEG. So yeah, definitely there is a future there. And maybe we don't need to keep using invasive techniques to evaluate sleep. And from my study and, like from my results, I would say if you do want to study sleep, I indicate using fragmentation, so the quality of sleep, instead of duration, quantity, because we saw that the main changes that you have is when you have fragmented sleep rather than just sleep restriction, because sleep in system like reduction by time, the body is a little bit, if it's better or more efficient in recovery than when you have fragmented sleep. So that is quite of an interesting outcome there. And then as you can see from the photo, one thing to mind is that equipment is expensive, so the colors are not cheap. So this I don't think is yet accessible, but then again, it's just one of those things. If more people start using or try to create their own devices, that they can become more popular. But yeah, you could have something like this. So one of the dogs just pulled their colors out and use it as a toy, and that is 1,000 pounds in the terrain. So yeah, that's definitely something that has to be considered because the cost at the moment, it's not yet cheap to be broadly used. Okay. I have some very quick acknowledgements to make. So my both supervisors from my PhD, so Rob Young and Cristiano, obviously they're now lovely colleagues. I cannot believe it's almost 4 years since I finished my PhD, but with pandemic, everything it just got it, like a little bit sidetracked. So that's why research is just now being put out. But I'm glad it is, and they have been like lovely and helped me with this journey. And then Dr. Anna Zamansky, as I said, that brought a beautiful side for this research, gave me a whole new area to explore in animal welfare. I'm very keen in trying to continue to do things with AI. It's such an interesting like concept of how we can facilitate. And I think there is a lot that can be explored, a lot to be beneficial for our research area. And also just to thank you some of my support in Brazil. So my students, Isabella, Roberto, the vet chief of the kennels, Ugo, and also my other student, Marcos, who is not in the picture. They have been fundamental. I would not be able to do this research without them. And that's all for me. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I think we have a kind of, I will showing up for your Q&A now, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.